Good afternoon, everybody. Nice to see you. This is a very big theatre, so some of you are very far away.
Come down.
But we have to try and come down if you feel like it. Yes, come closer, because we want this to be a nice, intimate conversation. The idea is that in this panel discussion, for which we have more time, we have 45 minutes, there will be conversation among the panelists, but there will also be some conversation with the audience. We do have microphones which we can use so that you, the audience members, can ask questions or make comments. And so I very much hope to involve you at various points during the conversation. Thank you. How nice of you to come down. Thank you. That's lovely. So,
you probably have to repeat it because people are coming in now.
Yes, if you come, yeah, I will repeat it. It's lovely. It's feeling very full now. That's great. Come down, please. Helga Nowotny, those of you who are with us this morning, I think that's probably everybody already know, as a professor from ETH in Zurich, and also former head of the European Research Council. Michael Levitt is 2013 Nobel laureate in chemistry, and Frank Wilczek is 2004 Nobel laureate in physics. In fact, he was awarded the prize at the same time as David Gross, who you met this morning. Please take this. And
thank you.
And we're here to discuss evidence and the value of uncertainty. So we are continuing, in a way, the conversations about scientific... Please, come in, come and sit down. Come down the front if you feel so inclined. We're continuing the discussions about scientific truth we had this morning. And as we were hearing and learning, scientific truth is not an absolute thing. It's something that is subject to change, and we must understand that. And as scientists, you three are all very used to that concept. So let's start there and talk about how you deal in your own work with the uncertainty of the problems and the solutions that you work on. Why don't we start with you, Frank?
Well, one way that, like it or not, we get to practice dealing with uncertainty is patience. This year's Nobel Prize in Physics, for instance, discovery of gravitational waves, was based on the theory of Albert Einstein, a prediction of a consequence of his general theory of relativity, that's 100 years old and could not be tested until an enormous program of technical developments, many of which could not have been foreseen, that finally brought it to fruition. And it was a similar story with the Higgs boson. That took only 50 years. And it's a similar story with the microwave background radiation, which is kind of our prime messenger from the Big Bang. And so I'm hoping it'll be a similar story for some of the things I've been pushing. So that's certainly one way.
So you're used to decades of uncertainty before this?
Decades of uncertainty. But of course, this is not something that's a passive process. We try to help by suggesting new techniques for the experimenters and encouraging further refinements and thought to accelerate the process. And in a way, still, it can be very difficult. Yeah.
But in a way, it's a necessary part, because if you don't have the uncertainty, you're not pushing hard enough.
That's right. I like to tell students when they begin with me that if you don't make mistakes, you're not working on hard enough problems. So mistakes are not only to be expected, but they're really to be welcomed, because they're very good learning experiences.
That's the perspective of a theoretical physicist. Michael, you're a biophysicist.
So I think uncertainty is intrinsic in everything. Any measurement has certain uncertainty. I think life itself has uncertainty. I think in any 1 minute, maybe nothing happened to you, but many, many bad things could have happened to you. So in some ways, you're generally ahead if you're alive. I think uncertainty can also be a very good thing. I think some of an area that I think is particularly interesting that scientists understand is the value of randomness. And some of why randomness is so valuable is that it's unbiased, and often it's very cheap, because you don't have to do anything except throw a dice. And some of the most powerful methods in optimization, for example, So the Monte Carlo method is just based on doing things with a certain level of randomness. But I think the lack of bias is a really powerful thing about uncertainty. I tell people who often come to me and say, I have these two choices and I can't decide. And they said, if you can't decide, it doesn't really make any difference. Decide that if the dice is over 3, you'll choose option 1, and if the dice is under 3, you'll do option 2, and do it that way. Now, very often when they do it that way, they suddenly discover that they actually prefer the other option. So sometimes randomness is very, very powerful. Uncertainty is actually a positive thing. I think people who are very certain about their lives miss out on all the good stuff, which is the uncertain part.
Helga.
Yeah, I can only echo what has been said so far, but I want to do it in my own words. And I would start out by saying we have to realize that research is inherently uncertain. Don't kid yourself. If you know already what you will find, it's development, or you use knowledge that is already available to achieve a certain goal, but it's not research. And this is the basic tenet of any kind of fundamental research or blue sky research, however you call it. It's inherently uncertain because you don't know what you're going to find. You don't know if, when, but, and this is where uncertainty comes in, it drives you forward. You want to cover the ground of what is still unknown. You want to move forward into the territory of the unknown. And therefore, uncertainty for scientists is an enormous, very important driving force to do it. And then I fully agree. I wrote a book, The Cunning of Uncertainty. And one way of how we can embrace uncertainty, also outside of science, but scientists do it all the time, is what you call randomness. I would call it serendipity. Serendipity in research, where you find something that you have not been looking for, but, and this is an important but, you are clever enough, you are lucky enough to understand the significance. And this plays an important role in research, and somehow you can also be ready for welcoming serendipity. So if you have too many plans and if you clutter every experimental space, then there is nothing left for serendipity to enter.
Yeah. Well, I think an important part of the art of theoretical physics, and I think of science generally, is to find uncertainty even in things that most people think are certain. To look at a theory and say, this could be better in some way. Look at a design and say, that's not perfect. And it's really an aesthetic process of systematically introducing uncertainty as a way to create new things.
Okay, so as scientists, you all accept uncertainty. And in fact, as you alluded to in a way, in our daily lives, we also live with uncertainty all the time. It's not such a strange concept. Very few of us, I mean, you said it, if you live a certain life, it's perhaps a more boring life, but very few of us do. Most of us are constantly aware that we don't really know what decisions we ought to be making on a daily basis.
Right.
And yet the dichotomy is that although we know that, and maybe people, well, we must discuss whether people do or do not understand that science proceeds like this, people want certainty in decision-making. They want certainty from politicians. They see uncertainty as a weakness. And it's very strange. Why should there be this separation between the lives we perhaps lead individually and the public life?
Yeah. Well, it's very important to realize that some things are more certain than others. We had a lecture from David Gross this morning about the scientific method, and that produces kind of the gold standard of truth when you can do repeated experiments, check things, establish things with great precision over hundreds of years of data collection. And so even those basics can be questioned, like Newton's theory of gravity was eventually surpassed by Einstein's theory. But there are some things that are really, really solid and well tested. But most things aren't like that once you step out of the hardcore of physics and chemistry and into the realms of history, or where there are contingent events. You really can't repeat the experiments. That are facts that are just facts. They're not truth with a capital T. So there are degrees of uncertainty, and complex sciences are somewhere in between, where you know the basic principles of physics, but you don't, without a lot more input, know what the weather's going to be tomorrow. There are a lot of contingent facts that have to be added, and biology is all about contingent facts.
Helga, sorry.
Yeah. I think one of the reasons for this, I call it the craving for certainty that we observe in society, it comes from the fact that we live in the present, but we want to know the future. We want to be able to prepare for the future. We are curious about the future. And this in itself is a very big human invention, because until the 18th century, most people on the planet believed the future was predestined. Mm-hmm. So some, gods, whoever, was already charting out the course of the future. And it was only during the time of the Enlightenment and what preceded it, and through science, that it became possible to imagine that you can at least partly shape the future. But this wishing to know the future goes back. This is why in every civilization you had divination practices, people using, be it animal bones, being, whatever, to try to predict the futures. And there were specialists for doing this, the magi and the various people who had the technical knowledge, but they also were advising the policymakers. They were advising the kings or the chiefs of the tribes, whoever, this will be your future.
It's a nice picture that 300 years ago, this conference, had we had it, would have had 3 magi sitting there instead of you. Well, you are the magi. Carry on.
So I think this is why we want to know, because we want to prepare for what the future will bring. And now we don't use divination methods anymore, but we have, there are futurists, there are think tanks, there are reports that are being commissioned, energy, the world in 2030, 2040, 2050, what will it be like? And very often these are mere extrapolations of trends that we see now, because we are so ill-equipped for what we cannot predict. We are ill-equipped to deal with uncertainty that comes and will surprise us.
Well, I think what General Hayden said this morning was very profound. What you can use rational means to identify is kind of a range of possibilities. We can't predict in detail what's going to happen, but it's easier to say what can't happen than what can happen, and sort of narrowing down the range of possibilities is what science is good at.
Just to finish this, because you also alluded to policymakers, and of course, they want to have certain answers, but very often they are not prepared to accept there is a bandwidth, and you can advise them, but only within a certain bandwidth. They want a point. And they don't know where the point is on which curve.
Here's the bandwidth that they want the point over there.
Or over there.
And so if there's a bandwidth, they say, no, that's not a point, so let's get a point. That one.
So if we take the standpoint that evidence from scientific sources varies, but it tends to come with a bandwidth, why is it that people have not learned that? Why do people expect it to give you precise answers? Is it because we're all subjected to the sort of, the media view that, smoking will give you lung cancer, or eating too much broccoli is somehow bad for you, or whatever it is. Everything is reduced to this cause and effect status. Is that?
I actually think that if we just think about the basic truth in science, and that is using some knowledge, we can predict what's going to happen. That isn't just in science. Almost everyone would agree that if I were to pour this on your pants, they would get wet, and you would not necessarily be very happy. So that is something, or if I close my eyes and walk in that direction, at some point I'm going to fall off the stage and maybe break my leg. So everyone is very aware of this. The people who believe in fake news, if you said to them, here's a glass of water and here's a glass of arsenic, choose which one you want to drink, no one will touch the arsenic. So there's certain things which, and I think we want to do that in general with everything. I think the difficulty with prediction is it works pretty well short term, like weather, but it really breaks down long term. And for example, if we look at probably the biggest discovery in the last 15 years was the smartphone. Steve Jobs' design of that particular phone. I don't think anyone predicted it, and it's had a bigger effect. If you really wanted to be controversial, you could say that it's had a bigger effect on society than all the Nobel Prizes put together, just because it's given everybody communication and computer brain power in their hands. It works in any language, there's no keyboard, etc., etc. So I think that uncertainty is something which it's difficult to know why people are so concerned about certainty. And I think that I personally enjoy uncertainty more than certainty. I think also, if we think about what other smart people have told us, say in the area of meditation, for them, you only live in the present. Now, one of the big criticisms of Donald Trump today was that he's only living in the present. So, it's interesting how these things go together. And we were saying that worrying about the future comes from not living in the present. But I think ultimately, every second we're alive is worth so much wonder that instead of worrying about what's going to happen, tomorrow is very uncertain. We may not be here, who knows? And you can worry about it if you're making the policy, but you probably shouldn't worry about it because you could easily be wrong. I have this image sometimes of somebody who was very pessimistic all his life. And he's on his deathbed, and suddenly he looks back and says, gee, nothing bad ever happened to me. He's going to think, what a waste. I could have done all these interesting things, and I was very pessimistic. I avoided them. I think ultimately we don't know, but basically life is fairly coherent. By and large, the world gets through pretty difficult times. I think we have to always realize that everything is super amplified by media, and it doesn't matter whether it's printing books 500 years ago, or fly sheets, or propaganda, or whatever. And things are basically like this, but basically things sort of continue pretty well. Otherwise, there wouldn't be an Earth. If there wasn't continuity, we wouldn't have ever have evolved life. If every single day the laws of physics changed, we would have real uncertainty.
I would like to come back to this cause-effect example that you brought in here with the glass.
I'm not going to do it even if you ask me to.
No, I'm not going to test your willingness to do it. But I think, evolution has equipped us for seeing and anticipating cause-effect relationships that were important for our survival. And this is an evolutionary instinct that we have had bestowed upon us. But now we live in a world that has become much more complex than surviving in a jungle or surviving, until your next meal. And we are not equipped to see the unintended consequences of our action. And that's a big problem, especially in a society where we see all the interconnections. If you think of climate change as one example, where you have to take into account atmospheric circulation, energy use, regulation, everything. It's such a complex web of interlinkages where you have also newly emergent properties, etc. And we are not equipped for that. But science provides us ways of looking a bit further ahead, of seeing at least some of these interconnections. And this is something that we have to get across much better to society, and to say it comes with uncertainties, of course, but this is but you get something in return. You can look a little bit further ahead. You can prepare for certain things, even if you know it's still fraught with uncertainties.
Indeed. I'd like to just quickly discuss the connection between belief and truth in science. I typed in scientifically true to Google, and the two top things that came up were, is Interstellar, the film, scientifically true? And is the Bible scientifically true? And that seemed, the first, okay. The second seemed to be a prime example of trying to apply the scientific method to conditions where you should not be applying the scientific method. But so is it fair to say that people try in their whatever understanding of the scientific method they have to apply it to everything to kind of shore up their own belief system, but a lot of it is kind of inappropriate application of the method. What do you think?
Well, I think the scientific method is a very good brand. You know, it has a very good reputation. It's created wonders, and so people want to have it on their own beliefs and ways of life. They want the brand that this is certified by the scientific method. But it's not so easy. The scientific method is a very specific thing that has to do with domains of knowledge where you can do repeated experiments and quantify and control. And even within science, what we usually call science, it doesn't apply to all branches. Some branches have contingent facts and need modifications of the scientific method. So,
well, historians of science say there is not one scientific method. Yeah. There are many different kinds of scientific methods.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Yes.
But, you know, one interesting example, because you mentioned the Bible, had it not been for German philologists at the turn of the 19th century starting to look critically with scientific methods to the Bible, you know, we would still be there where many people are with the Quran today. You know, it's a book that has been written according to the words of God. And what this critical analysis of the Bible brought was a lot of evidence, if you want. You know, when was it written? Most likely by whom? What was superseding it? So it was sort of dismantling a religious truth and turning it into a historical, call it cultural artifact or whatever you want to call it. And I think this is a good example of the scientific method that was brought onto something that was closed before as don't touch it because it's not amenable to scientific ways of inquiry.
Okay, thank you. I would like to open up for questions. Do we have any questions or comments from the audience? Please be thinking. Yes, in the front, please. Kalle.
We can see you very well. But
so you have all explained very well why we have to accept uncertainty. We have to live with it, and we may even have to embrace it. But when we select our leaders in business, in politics, and so forth, we want them to be forceful. We want them to have a clear view. And we certainly do not want uncertainty in leadership. I think, in a way, we would be much better off if we could have leaders that have wisdom rather than fanaticism. But how do we get there?
Please.
So just to deal with it, I think that if we were to apply the methods for selecting leaders to other walks of life, so we would choose our best scientists by how many people voted for them. Or if the head of a big company was somebody randomly chosen or who had a big network, I think we wouldn't really succeed very well. And I think in some ways it's interesting how politics and leadership, and I think you know, there's discussions of democracy versus non-democracy, but I think that you know, do we actually have a true democracy anywhere in the world? I don't know. And when the power of lobbyists is as powerful as it is in the USA, and you can buy politicians, maybe they should just be bought outright. Maybe Google should come to the Prime Minister of Britain and say, look, you're going to get $10 million when you leave, you're going to do what I say, and that's it. Make it outright. But I think there is hope, and this actually comes, the very first session this morning, we heard some clips of people being asked, and the last person was saying that he hoped that areas, say, of artificial intelligence could actually help inform government. And one thing I remember, I was here 2 years ago when the actual dialogue was about artificial intelligence, and somebody from IBM spoke about the Watson that could actually play chess really, really well, and now there are many better computers than that. And I had a sort of feeling, wouldn't it be wonderful if every president of the USA or every politician had was mandated to go and ask the computer what I should do. Do I invade Iraq? And the computer would say, blah, 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 yes or no. He wouldn't have to listen to the computer. That decision would be recorded. I just somehow feel that there are going to be in the future much, much better ways. In some ways, if we look at maybe the best system in the world right now is the United States, it was something that was written over 200 years ago. There are very few scientific theories that still hold after 200 years. I think our whole way of doing things needs a lot of improvement. And we need to do that.
Helga?
How to choose leaders, of course, is an old topic. It starts with Plato, who wanted the philosophers to be the philosopher king. And also in the 18th century, Condorcet was thinking about how he could apply mathematics. Today we would say, let's have an algorithm to choose the best system and to determine what the population wants, and you run it mathematically. And I think we are cautious that we do not want to have our leader chosen by an algorithm. And I think we are right in doing that. But we could do much better in setting up the criteria. What is it we expect from our leaders? And just to give you one example, this was a political scientist working at Columbia University by the name of Fran Linz, and he had looked at democracies that die, especially in Latin America. And one of his findings was they had leaders who did not condone violence and who did nothing to protect minorities of any kind. And these were the worst predictors for a very bad outcome. So I think we can set up some criteria that we want to hold our leaders accountable to, and these would be two very important ones.
We seem to be arguing that the scientific method can be very widely applied to every sphere of life.
I see its applications.
Well, scientific methods have been applied with great success to picking out the best baseball players for the money, the best basketball players for the money, and I think also now in corporate recruiting, and certainly when we choose students, we evaluate based on a lot of information that we require to be supplied. I think it's quite scandalous that when we elect political leaders, we ask so little of them to describe themselves in quantitative ways, to supply their tax returns, to maybe take some exams, to get some sense of what they really are capable of or consist of. So I know that would be a revolution, but I think it would not be a bad idea to be more rigorous in choosing presidents, for instance.
It makes perfect
so
sense.
So that it's up to the standards of the National Basketball Association.
It makes perfect sense, but I'm still stuck on this, well, I'm calling this dichotomy, this idea that we know this. We know this, and yet people are very willing to grab a piece of evidence and use it as the whole basis for making a decision and kind of put their belief in it and go with it. Why do people do that?
I think that probably human beings have been hardwired for tribalism. And for me, competing teams, somebody who supports one basketball team versus another team, they'll kill each other for that. And it's something which is totally interchangeable. There's nothing a priori better about, say, the Red Sox versus something else, and I'm not a sports fan, but perfectly logical, sensible people take sports very seriously. And I think, that's probably good for them, but that same energy is then put into religions, it's put into politics, and I think in all cases it probably has about the same level of scientific basis. It's worrying, but I think it's a human condition to do something about it.
Well, I would slightly disagree. I think if you look back at evolution, it is a mixture between competition and cooperation. And we are now discovering, the amount of cooperation that actually happens among bacteria, among various life forms, etc., that was necessary, while you have competition at the same time. And once this gets out of balance in our societies, and we are seeing now it does get out of balance because we have lots of competition and we have less and less cooperation because we have a fragmentation. And this fragmentation is reinforced through social media, because then people can close themselves off in mind and in body in terms of their bubble, and they don't even want to hear, or they ignore that there's anything outside of it. And this goes back to partly the leaders that are, I would hold them accountable. You know, if you let a society fragment in so many ways, there is something deeply wrong with allowing this to happen.
We have another question here, please. Oh, if you could use the microphone.
Get a microphone.
Thank you.
Hi, and thank you for a great discussion. I want to go back to where you started on the concept of patience. Because for me, it's a lot about what you're talking about is a time frame where you expect a change in the near time future. So how do we expand our time frame to, like, how do we get more patience in the society?
That's a good question.
How do we get more patience? Well, patience gets forced upon us.
But how do those in society who are desperate for an answer now learn to wait and bide their time? Leaders and the general public who need to be behind those leaders. Who wants to go for it?
Well,
Michael.
You know,
Michael first, then you.
Okay, so
take a value.
you know, I think, I mean, in some ways, patience, I think, is something which is probably always a good idea. Things are never as bad as they seem. They're probably never as good as they seem. We tend to amplify things both positively and negatively. One thing that is interesting is that by all statistical accounts, the world has never been in better shape than it is now, even with the problems of global warming, i.e., literacy is super high, childbirth is really low, poverty is getting lower and lower and lower. There are graphs that show how things have changed over the last 200 years, and everything looks amazing. Violence is down, you know, people killed in military action is way down than what it used to be, and people all believe the opposite. And that's something which we really need to think about. I think if we believe things that are contrary to the facts, that is a very bad idea, because the facts are true. And I think that if you take a global view of the world, I think one really, really important change in the last 20 years is that what used to be the preserve of the West has now become adopted by almost the entire globe. And this basically means that there's more competition. And more competition is a really good idea, because you could actually argue that what's maybe bad for the Americans is really good for the Chinese. And if you think about yourself as a citizen of the world, that's fine. I think if you want to do really stupid things, let's imagine you refuse to vaccinate your children. At some point, you'll become extinct. It's a very hard lesson, and if you aren't prepared to worry about good renewable energy, at some point your companies will be buying only Chinese things, and you're going to run out of money. So it seems to me that this is a good buffer. The fact that the world is not only much better off in terms of these indicators, but also much more globally united, I think is an enormously positive force for the future.
I would agree with you that the world is better off in many ways, but at the same time, our standards, our expectations, our values have also evolved. And we are now demanding inclusiveness. We think it's self-evident that people with disabilities, are part of society, that we have to do everything, to make them feel part of the society, and so on. So many things remain that are ugly in terms of, and underdeveloped in terms of our values. But nevertheless, there is an evolution of our values and of our standards of morality as well. Therefore, I think in science, I agree, patience means to be persistent. And this is important. But in society, I think we have a right to be impatient. because we have this wonderful means. We have all the science, we have the technology, we have models of complexity, simulations, that let us look ahead, etc. And we have a right to implement the insights that we gain from them. So be impatient. You have all the right to be impatient.
Well, you should be realistic about what you're up against. I agree with that. But these kinds of questions go way back to philosophers like Seneca and Plato, who talked about self-control. And if people want to learn about patience, I just urge them to reflect on their own life and their experiences. I know in my life, some of the things I most regret was when I lost patience, got angry, did something impulsive. And so that's a way of learning patience and wisdom. That doesn't mean complacency. I mean, but you have to be realistic, and that's necessary in order to be persistent. If you get too easily discouraged because you were too optimistic, then you give up. You don't. So that's not a virtue. So patience doesn't mean complacency. Patience means setting goals that are ambitious, but being realistic about it's not going to be easy and it's going to take time.
Thank you. Okay, I'm coming to it. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Michael, Michael raised the question, the issue of vaccination. And for many scientists, that's sort of the poster child case of people making decisions based on little evidence, wrongly, and really not understanding science. And I think a lot of scientists are just at a loss to understand why on earth all these educated people are rejecting something that is so obviously a good idea.
But if you want another example, which I remember finding really shocking, I'm a biophysicist, and I visited the European Molecular Biology Lab it was actually at that time in Cambridge rather than in Heidelberg. And basically in the canteen, and this was probably 20 years ago, they said, no GMO food is served here. And I was shocked. So this is an issue where I think the Americans are way ahead of the Europeans. There is no evidence. Everyone seems to agree with that. And yet we believe very strongly about how bad this is. Now, maybe there is evidence. I'm not trying to say there isn't. But, it's again, certain things we believe in. Today at lunch it said, at least in our lunch, there was no lactose, or there was lactose in the food. And at some level, this level of sensitivity, variety is a really good idea. And if you're very lactose intolerant, maybe you should, be very, very careful. But it seems to me we can't worry about that always.
But if you listen to people, these educated people, they give you other reasons. I mean, if you dig a bit deeper, and it's really the interest of the individual against the interest of the population. Because we know unless a certain percentage of the population is vaccinated, you're not protected. And it's the, if you want, the egotism of the parents of a child who say, my child is more important, what do I care about the rest of society? So it's not so much disputing what science says, but saying, I have my interest to protect my child against, all kinds of imagined risks that are associated with vaccination. And also with GMOs, I was in Switzerland at the time when there was the referendum for or against GMO. Now, it turned out that in the same country, in the German-speaking part, people were much more risk-averse than in the French-speaking part. So you say, well, this culture, the French are more risk-loving than the German-speaking. But then it turned out that the reasons behind it, below it, were in the German-speaking part of Switzerland, you have an agriculture, a monoculture. You have vast, and people were afraid that Monsanto would take over, the seeds would have to be bought every year, etc. In the French-speaking part, you have mountains. You have very little agriculture, so people did not care. So I'm just saying, very often there are other interests below it. I'm not saying, this is better or it's worse, but it's not so much the science is an easy target. It becomes easy to attack, and we would make a mistake in interpreting everything as anti-science without looking deeper into it.
Thank you. Thank you. Please, question.
My question would be to the panel about your thoughts on the importance of education. As we heard earlier today, there is some threat to our universities and our educators. And as an educator, I'm really concerned what I hear. And particularly, you've been mentioning things like uncertainty. And as an educator, how do we, as educator, then take that forward to our students?
Please, Michael, go ahead.
So I think directly dealing with education, it seems to me that one area of science and mathematics that has been really neglected at school education is statistics. And uncertainty is a very intrinsic part of statistics. And it seems to me that, you know, even 6-year-old children should be given dice and, you know, make distributions and understand what a mean is and a standard deviation, get some feeling of what statistics is. And I think that this is something, I don't even know the history of why, for example, we teach people how to add fractions, which is number theory, but we totally ignore statistics in school. And a lot of people think statistics is very difficult. But basically, it's very easy to do experimental statistics. Just have children throw a coin and record the throws, and you can analyze that chain. So I think that would be my number one recommendation for students.
Well, I think education is all important. And I'm very pleased that people have started to quantify that in a way that can be transmitted as objective data. This is a very recent study from out of Harvard and elsewhere that compared identified talented children in the early stages of their education with different kinds of backgrounds, different income levels, different genders, and so forth. And then their eventual contribution to the economy, especially to innovation, as quantified by the number of patents they got and so forth. And there was a tremendous correlation between or anti-correlation between the income level and these other factors, gender, and the eventual outcome. So talent, you could identify talent, but if you don't nurture it, it's a great loss to society. And the innovation is ultimately what drives economic growth in the long run, economic advancement for everybody. There's nothing more important. And we can put our finger on what it'll take to improve that. And I think the single most important thing is to make sure that everybody gets a good chance at education.
Let me just ask, we have another question, but let me just ask first, do you think that education, science education, teaches the scientific method well? I mean, do people come out of school, general people, come out of school knowing what the scientific method is, or do they think that the science is all about certainties? Helga?
No, I think there's a big mistake that is being done in the way how we present science. We present it very often with the end results, and we say, look, you know, this is the outcome. Believe it or not, but it's the authority of science that tells you this is the outcome. And we do far too little to take people through the process. What does it actually mean to do research? And there's this wonderful way of how François Jacob spoke about day science and night science. And day science for him was, you know, the finished product. You can bask in the glory of having achieved something. But then there is night science. You are frustrated. Your experiment does not work. You have to start again. And it's one side, two sides of the same medal. And to explain to people what it actually means to do research, how to think about an experiment, how to set it up, what you do if it does not work, etc. And you can do it with very simple ways and build it into the curriculum. And I think this would be the way forward. And of course it means also statistics. People are not well equipped to think in terms of probabilities, but if you explain it to them in natural frequency, they get the point. So there are ways of overcoming it. And so I think this is really the way how to go.
Thank you. And Sweden in the wintertime is therefore a very good representation of science. Long, long nights and very short days. Sorry, Frank. Yes.
Well, what occurs to me here is that the scientific method isn't something you put in a box and only apply to physics or only apply to things we call science. It's a way of thinking that is kind of coterminous with just rational thought.
Yeah.
And people can learn the scientific method from things that you don't necessarily think of as science, from solving puzzles. They can learn statistics. It occurred to me during this long discussion of statistics, for instance, and uncertainty, that people gamble. People analyze sports teams and their averages, and in a very, very, very sophisticated ways. And they're doing statistics, they're doing science without realizing that it's science. And I think so. I think there are many opportunities to teach people how to think scientifically, how to think rationally, besides teaching them physics or chemistry. And one last thought on this, which is that people are sometimes saying, oh, it's too difficult for me, calculus is too difficult for me. That they should realize that all of that, any particular branch of science that I know of, is simpler and easier to learn than a language. And almost everyone learns a language. And so you shouldn't, people shouldn't be intimidated. They should know that it's humans who did it. Feynman used to say, what one fool can invent, another fool can understand.
Helga, go.
Yeah, let me just go back. There is not the one scientific method. There are different scientific approaches. And there was a molecular biologist well known to Michael Waddington, the discovery of epigenetics way back in the 40s. And he wrote a book in the 1940s at a dark time in Europe. He was afraid that Nazi Germany would overrun England at that time, or that the English government would give in just as the French government had given in. And in this moment he wrote a book called The Scientific Attitude. And it's only about applying the scientific attitude to the problems of his time. And it's a great book, and I think this is probably the message that we should take from this discussion, the scientific attitude, scientific way of looking at the world and applying it wherever we think it is necessary.
Thank you. That would be a perfect endpoint, but there's been a very patient person with a microphone there, so we should take that last question.
Sorry.
I have a question for actually Professor Helga. So you've said that when it comes to research, if you know what you're looking for, you're not actually doing any research. So, I mean, as far as I'm a physics student, so as far as physics is concerned, isn't that statement more related to experimental physics than theoretical physics? Because as Professor Frank pointed out, Einstein knew what he would expect because of his theory of gravity. And he said, okay, light would bend this certain amount, and Eddington actually found that it actually bent almost the same exact amount. So theoretical physics is a form of research. So what would you have to say about that?
I'm sorry, I did not understand everything.
Was the question to Professor Wilczek or to
Professor Helga?
Professor Helga.
Yeah, well, I try to explain what serendipity is. And serendipity means you're discovering whatever you do in research, a new phenomenon. You're discovering a cause-effect relation. You're discovering a new substance that nobody has discovered before. and you do it by chance. It happens by chance. That's one side. But then you have to realize its significance, because very often these things pop up and you think, well, it's noise, it's not important, etc. And there are famous examples, for instance, in high-temperature superconductivity. There was a team that found exactly what the people who got the Nobel Prize for later, because they knew the significance of what they found. So that's
Thank you very much for your answer.
serendipity.
Thank you for your question.
Yeah? Okay.
Sadly, we are over time. And as you know, I'm not allowed to go over time, so we have to stop.
Sorry.
But
Sorry.
I'd like to thank all three of my wonderful panelists and you all for being here. Thanks very much indeed.
Yeah.